Hello and welcome to the Sidebar, presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm previously an LA County prosecutor for nearly a decade, and now I'm a criminal defense attorney based in Los Angeles. You can find me on all social platforms at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. We are recording this on Wednesday, October 8th, 2025. In this week's episode, a woman facing trial for the fatal stabbing of a 3-year-old boy in a grocery store parking lot. Plus, a delay in trial for a man accused of killing his wife after a jailhouse attack raises questions about his competency for trial. But first, a former NFL quarterback facing felony charges after an alleged parking spot altercation in which he sustained stab wounds. I am flying solo today, so let's just go ahead and jump right in. First, out of Indianapolis, Indiana, a former NFL quarterback is facing a felony battery charge after an argument over a parking space. Mark Sanchez suffered stab wounds and was pepper sprayed in the incident, with prosecutors alleging the 10-year NFL vet and sports analyst incited the violent altercation. Reportedly, the confrontation unfolded after 69-year-old truck driver Perry Toll backed into a parking space in the loading docks of a downtown Indianapolis hotel. Prosecutors say that Sanchez wanted the spot for himself and attacked the man, more than 30 years his senior, who produced a knife to defend himself against Sanchez. The alleged attack left both men injured, but so far prosecutors have only announced charges against Sanchez. Along with the criminal proceedings, lawyers for Toll have already announced a lawsuit suing Sanchez and his employer, Fox Sports, meaning the alleged parking spot altercation could have long-lasting legal repercussions. First of all, this story is absolutely wild. But let's talk a little bit about why is it only Sanchez that is seeing criminal charges here? And why in these cases where there appears to be mutual combat, do we only usually see one person getting charged? Well, I think, first of all, it intuitively makes sense. If both people are committing crimes, it's kind of hard to find where the criminal conduct really lies. But really, this comes down to a question of self-defense and when can a person defend themselves. In other words, can you be the person who starts the altercation and then defend yourself and claim self-defense? And the answer pretty clearly, according to case law and criminal jurisprudence, is that no, you cannot. You cannot create the situation with that, which then allows you to use physical force. So apparently, according to reports and prosecutors in this case, Sanchez was the original aggressor. He got into some sort of altercation with this truck driver, who's a much older man, a much smaller man, by the way. That included throwing the man to the ground on more than one occasion. That man then pepper sprayed Sanchez, and in the course of defending himself, produced a knife and stabbed Sanchez. Now, you might say, well, Sanchez got the worst of it. He got stabbed. He had emergency surgery. But if Sanchez was the aggressor, then he can't claim self-defense for the injuries that he did to this man. And the injuries caused to him are rightfully in self-defense by the truck driver. And therefore, that's why he's not even being charged in this case. I will say, too, that there's elements of him being Sanchez being highly intoxicated that may have played a role in the charging decision being made by prosecutors. And it does sound like there is surveillance video which shows the altercation, which may make it even more clear to them. But again, if as long as the self-defense being used by this truck driver was not so unreasonable a response to the attack, then he's got a righteous claim for self-defense. And then Sanchez is just the one left holding the bag, as it were, from a criminal culpability perspective, because he's the one that started the whole thing. And by the way, the injuries to this truck driver are also very severe. If you've seen pictures of him online, he was also hospitalized and need of recovery. Also, apparently, Indiana has some of the most robust self-defense laws in the nation, which means that the case for the truck driver is probably more clear-cut under Indiana law. And the case for Sanchez is probably a little bit more difficult for him to show that's how the person who starts the altercation is going to be the one claiming self-defense. End of the day, Sanchez is in real trouble here. This is not one of those situations where I feel like you could see a person who's a celebrity coming from wealth and privilege kind of walking away from this whole thing. It'll be interesting to me to see how this plays out. And here's where I'm coming from. When I was a prosecutor, this type of a case, we would charge it as a felony assault with a special enhancement for great bodily injury. Great bodily injury alone can add a 7-year prison enhancement to sentencing guidelines for this type of a case. You put somebody into the hospital for something like that, I don't care who you are, what kind of criminal record you've got, you're looking at a prison sentence. You're looking at an offer from the prosecution that includes prison. Now, are there other mitigating factors here? You could argue that, well, intoxication played a role. Sure, it played a role, but is that an excuse? Is that really a defense? Is that really something that his team can rely upon to excuse his behavior and mitigate his behavior? It could even arguably be an aggravating circumstance that you were so intoxicated that you were going out like a madman, attacking people for no reason. There's allegations that there's also a charge about unlawfully entering a vehicle. It sounds like at some point he tried to get into the truck driver's car to maybe move the car, or I don't know what. It just all sounds like a mess. We will say, too, that reports are saying that Sanchez is telling authorities he has no memory of the incident, which may speak to his level of sobriety or lack thereof at the time as well. But I will tell you, I would not be surprised if this came out with a prison offer to begin with. Honestly, I think that him and his team need to prepare themselves for that. I know we see this all the time with celebrities, and they get into trouble, and somehow there's a big cash payout, amends are made, they create a charity, they go into some sort of, rehab and do a bunch of counseling, and it all seems to go away. You put someone into the hospital over no reason, you attack that person. I mean, right now, in my view, don't even consider the injuries to Sanchez. That's not part of the filing consideration here. The idea that he may have got the worst end of all of this by being stabbed is not going to help him out from a criminal perspective. I mean, he's looking at possibly, most likely, more than anything, losing his job, losing, whatever endorsements and future work he had. But he also may be looking at losing his liberty. It's a really, really horrific case. And now that there's a lawsuit a part of it, you got to imagine that his employers are probably looking to distance themselves. Fox Sports, I'm sure, is going to try to settle this thing as quickly as they possibly can. Now, do they have liability in this? Do they carry some responsibility? Well, it would come down to an argument of whether or not Sanchez was still operating under the course and scope of employment at the time that he took these actions. I would be curious to know, if I were the plaintiff's attorney, where was he coming from? Where had he been drinking? Had he been at a work sanctioned event and he got highly intoxicated and overserved, or was he just out on his own? If he was out on his own, and this had nothing to do with Fox Sports, he might be left out to dry by Fox Sports as well. It is pretty amazing to me, though, and I'm just saying this as an aside, that the lawsuit was filed this quickly. Usually you see these things take a few months before a lawsuit is ever filed. So a very trigger-happy plaintiff's attorney out there filing this lawsuit right away. Nothing wrong with it, but just interesting that it happened so quickly. Bad news for Mark Sanchez, to say the least. He's going to have a whole heap of trouble on his hands for quite some time, and it may even include him going to prison for a little bit of time. But we shall see how this all works out. Let's move to Cleveland, Ohio, where a woman is facing trial for the murder of a 3-year-old child after the boy was stabbed to death outside of a grocery store next to his mother. Bianca Ellis has pled not guilty to 10 felony charges, including felony murder and attempted murder in the death of Julian Wood. The boy was riding in a shopping cart when Ellis allegedly approached the boy and his mother with a knife before fatally stabbing the child and injuring his mother. There was no altercation that motivated the attack, and Ellis and the young boy and mother had no connection to each other. Ellis was reportedly homeless at the time of the incident and was initially declared incompetent to stand trial until her competency was restored. Ellis has pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and her trial is ongoing, and we will continue to keep you updated on this tragic case. This gives us a good opportunity to talk about the difference between competency and insanity. And we hear these terms tossed around quite a bit, and they're always in the mental health realm. But what are the real differences between them, specifically from a legal perspective? Well, one good way to think about it is that competency, the question of competency, has to do with the present moment. Is that person competent now as they sit in the chair in court to stand trial? Insanity, however, when you plead not guilty by reason of insanity, has to do with your mental state at the time that the crime was committed. So there's a temporal difference between these two considerations. There's also a difference in degree and what we're looking at. Competency is a very low threshold. It is basically the bare minimum of understanding of the proceedings taking place. Does the person, the defendant in court, understand the charges against them? Do they understand who the judge is, who the prosecutor is, who their defense attorney is, and what roles each of them play? And can they assist in their own defense? Not meaning can they think strategically and do they know what motions to file, but can they answer questions to their attorney and somewhat help in their own defense? Again, a very, very low threshold. The other thing about competency is someone can go in and out of competency, is in this case with Bianca Ellis. She was at one point declared incompetent and unable to stand trial. And then through the use of medications and therapy, her competency was restored and she was allowed to proceed on with trial. Insanity, however, asks a question in its most simple terms of, does that person have the ability at the time of the crime to appreciate the difference between right and wrong? Did they know what they were doing? Did they understand the consequences of their actions? Did they know what they were doing is wrong? Now, how will this all manifest itself in the trial? Well, the defense is going to need to demonstrate that she could not, as we just said, understand what she was doing was either morally or legally wrong at the time that she was doing it. The defense has taken an interesting strategy in this case. In their opening statements, they admit that the murder was committed. They admit that their client committed that murder. They admit that it's an absolute tragedy, but what they're saying to jurors is reserve your judgment on those things until you understand her level of sanity at the time, and that they intend to prove that she was in fact insane and could not appreciate the consequences of her actions. The prosecution, for their part, understandably so, has said, concentrate on her actions. What do they mean? What do her words mean? Things like, did she run after the stabbing? Did she dispose of the knife? Did she make statements to police? Did she behave in a way that may be, to us, from the outside looking in, be crazy behavior, be something that we can't imagine somebody being in their right mind and doing that? And I think the act itself speaks to that. Stabbing a young boy for no reason whatsoever is what I think any of us would call, quote unquote, crazy. But for the purposes of a criminal court in insanity, you have to show that she understood what she was doing. And the way that you can demonstrate that from the prosecutor's perspective is by pointing to things like, people who understand what they did was wrong, run. People who understand what they did was wrong, dispose of the knife and try to hide it. They say things to police. They say things during the course of the crime itself that might help people appreciate that they knew, maybe they did it for crazy reasons, but they knew what they were doing in that moment was wrong. So again, a tragic case. We will see how this all plays out. But one thing to keep in mind is this is no small question. If she is found guilty but not guilty. Guilty for her actions, for committing the murder, but not guilty by reason of insanity as far as criminal responsibility, she could go to a mental health institution instead of to prison. And then it's up to the state to decide, when does her sanity return to her? It's not a traditional prison sentence where she could go off to prison for the rest of her life, but it could be something where one day, if she's restored to mental health and an evaluation is made of her and the state board decides to, she could be released. So not a small question. Again, such a sad case. It personally tears me apart to think about a child that young being killed in front of his own mother. I have a hard time walking through what that mother was going through in those final moments. Such a horrific nightmare. Let's move to Norfolk County, Massachusetts, where trial has been delayed for a man accused of killing his wife as the defendant undergoes a competency hearing following a jailhouse attack. Brian Walsh stands accused of slaying his wife, Anna, before allegedly dismembering her body and discarding the remains, which have still not been found. While incarcerated, Walsh was the victim of an attack last month, which left him brutally stabbed, and Walsh's attorneys claimed that he has suffered physical and mental decline, rendering him incompetent for trial. Though prosecutors objected to the delay, noting that Walsh was returned to the prison after medical care on the same day the incident occurred, the judge ultimately ruled in Walsh's favor. A competency hearing to determine Walsh's ability to stand trial is scheduled for October 27th, and no new trial date has yet been set. All right, another opportunity for us to talk about this idea of competency. In this case, at least not yet, we're not talking about insanity and the difference there, but just the idea that a person accused of a crime has now, in the middle of pretrial proceedings, been declared or not declared. The question of competency has come up. Another thing to think about is that this is not a pretrial issue per se. It's a issue as it arises at any time, meaning this can come up before trial. This can come up during trial. It really has to do with the mental state of the person at that time. And you understand the policy reasons behind it. We have no interest in sham trials, which put a person who simply cannot understand what's taking place around them on trial for something as serious as murder, which then helps you understand why the judge would put a halt to things in the middle of pretrial when trial was looming in this case. This case was expected to go to trial at the end of this month, and now who knows? He's going to undergo a 20-day evaluation. So this is certainly going to delay things, and that may frustrate people, and that may frustrate you who are listening, who have been watching this case closely and eager to see it get started. Why did the judge do this? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, the judge does not determine competency. It's not like the defense attorneys may say, Your Honor, I'm questioning the competency of my client, and the judge takes a look at him and asks him a few questions and says, yes, I don't believe this person is competent. Even the judge seeing odd behavior in court, it's not entirely up to the judge to decide competency. What the judge can and does and oftentimes will do is, if a quote unquote doubt is declared by the defense, Your Honor, I'm declaring a doubt regarding the competency of my client, the judge will order an evaluation done. And that is just to protect everyone's interests, to protect the defendant's interests, to make sure that we're not putting somebody on trial who's not competent and doesn't appreciate what's going on, but also to protect the integrity of the trial itself. What a nightmare. What an awful circumstance it would be if somebody had their competency called into question. The judge took it upon themselves to deny that request without any evaluation being done. A trial was had, a conviction was rendered, and then the appellate court turns around and undoes everything because they weren't given a proper evaluation of their competency, or because their competency was at issue and it wasn't realized until later. So they will Brian Walsh will undergo an evaluation. And what they're trying to determine here is, Is he just depressed? Does he need medication? Has he really deteriorated in his mental state? Is he malingering? In other words, is he making the whole thing up in an attempt to deny everything, which could, by the way, backfire on him tremendously? But think again about that standard. The evaluator is essentially going to have to say, this person doesn't know what's going on. Not this person's having a bad day, not this person's depressed, not this person's anxious, but this person doesn't know what's going on. The person doesn't know what they're charged with. They don't know what the judge is doing. They can't aid in their own defense. And even then, we're not talking about the end of the trial. We're not talking about not guilty of the crime. We're just talking about delaying it till he can receive treatment and have competency restored. So it's a good decision by the judge. What does this mean, though, for the defense? Can we guess where they might be headed in this trial? Normally, you might say, well, they're laying the basis, or this could be the precursor to some sort of mental health defense, maybe an insanity plea like we saw in the Ellis case. Here, though, I think not so likely because of the circumstances of this case. Remember, this case involves Google searches about covering up a murder, about disposing of a body, motivation based upon financial pressures, hiding the remains of his wife, allegedly around disposing of her body parts in different areas, cleaning up after all of it. More and more evidence of what are we concerned with here? Understanding the consequences of one's actions, understanding the difference between right and wrong. But it could play a role for sentencing. If he is suffering from some sort of mental health crisis, either at the time of the crime or since then, it could be something that we see come up after a conviction and their efforts to mitigate on sentencing. But again, a case we will continue to follow, a case that frustrates me that he's not going to trial because I was looking forward to seeing how that all played out, but we're just going to have to wait a little bit longer. And in the long run, that's the best thing. But in the meantime, that is our show for this week. As always, we'd like to give our sincerest thanks to our listeners and viewers for tuning in. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ, or go to joshuaritter.com. And if you want to hear my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, please check out my new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And you can find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and we would love to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, please tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.